Imagine you are 4 years old. The grass is wet under your shoes. The creek nearby makes that sound, that soft, constant rushing that makes everything feel safe. Other kids are running ahead of you, laughing. The sun is still high. Your parents are close enough that if you turned around, you could find them. And then a man speaks to you. He doesn't grab you. He doesn't threaten you. He just invites you to play a game. Follow the shadow, he says, and the world you knew disappears. Welcome back to Obscure Ends, the channel that lives in the space between the last known fact and the first unanswered question. I'm glad you're here. Today's case is one that has sat with me for a long time, not because it is the most violent, not because it has a dramatic resolution, but because of the architecture of it, the strange, almost deliberate shape of the mystery left behind. This is the story of Nyleen Kay Marshall, a 4-year-old girl who vanished from a mountain forest in Montana in the summer of 1983, and a man unknown, unnamed, unlocated, who spent years reaching out to the world to describe exactly what he had done to her. He wanted people to know. That detail alone should stop you in your tracks. June 25th, 1983, a Sunday. The Elkhorn Mountains in western Montana are the kind of place that photographs can't quite capture. Dense pine forests, cold, clear creeks, the feeling of absolute remoteness even when you're only a short drive from Helena. It's the kind of landscape that makes people feel both very small and very peaceful at the same time. A group of families had come together that afternoon for a picnic organized by the Capital City Radio Club, a hobbyist group that Nyleen's stepfather, Kim Marshall, was part of. These were ordinary people doing an ordinary thing, eating together, letting the kids run around, enjoying a Montana summer day. Nyleen was 4 years old. Brown hair, blue eyes, a chipped baby tooth, dimples on both cheeks. 29 pounds, 3 feet 2 inches tall. She was the kind of small that makes the world look enormous. At some point around 4 in the afternoon, Nyleen and a group of other children drifted towards the banks of Maupin Creek. The water was shallow. There were beaver dams nearby, the kind of thing that absolutely captivates a 4-year-old. The older kids moved ahead. They weren't worried. They were just kids being kids. When they turned around, Nyleen was gone. But here's the detail that matters. The detail that changes this from a tragic accident into something deliberate and deeply sinister. Before she vanished, at least one child noticed her talking to a man. He was wearing a purple jogging suit. He was trying to get her to play a game. The game had a name. Follow the shadow. That's not an accident. That's not a child wandering off into the trees, confused and cold. That is a calculated approach, a lure designed specifically for someone Nyleen's age. Because shadows are playful, shadows are silly, shadows move in interesting ways when you're 4 years old and the sun is still out. Whoever this man was, he had thought about it. Search teams spent 10 days in those mountains, 10 days of combating the forest, the creek beds, the slopes. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints that led anywhere useful, no sign of Nyleen at all. She had simply ceased to be there. For 2 years, the Marshall case went cold in the way that cases do when there's simply nothing to work with. Nyleen's parents distributed thousands of flyers. They refused to stop. But the leads dried up, and the official investigation hit a wall. Then on November 27, 1985, more than 2 years after the disappearance, a phone call came in to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. A man, anonymous, called. He said he had Nyleen. Now, anonymous tip calls about high-profile missing children cases happen. They're usually cranks or disturbed people seeking attention, and investigations learn to filter them quickly. But this man said things that were different. He said things that he shouldn't have been able to know. Details about the case that had never been made public. Specifics that only someone present that day or someone with direct knowledge could have possessed. Investigators were disturbed, but they couldn't trace the call in time. 2 months later, in early 1986, a typewritten letter arrived, sent to Child Find of America, a missing children's nonprofit in New York. It was postmarked for Madison, Wisconsin. The author claimed to be the same man who had called, and he began, in the most chilling possible way, to explain himself. He said he had been driving through the Elkhorn Park area between Helena and Boulder when he saw a small girl alone on the road. He said she was crying, frightened. He held her, and she was shaking, and he made a decision. He decided to keep her. He described having a comfortable investment income. He said he worked from home. He said he homeschooled the girl, whom he now called Kay. He said they traveled frequently together across the United States, through Canada, into the United Kingdom. He wrote that she was happy, that she liked traveling with him, that he loved her. And then, buried inside this almost domestic-sounding account, came the acknowledgement that investigators confirmed pointed to sexual abuse. He knew her family missed her. He wrote that directly. He acknowledged it, and he said he could not let her go. Over the next several months, Child Find received more letters, more calls. They were traced to payphones, including one near a pharmacy in Edgerton, Wisconsin. The calls kept coming, and then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The man went quiet, and he was never identified. Here's the part of this case that I keep returning to, the part that I think deserves far more analysis than it typically receives. Why did he reach out at all? Think about this carefully. This man, whoever he was, had successfully taken a child without leaving a trace. Law enforcement had no leads. The search had ended. 2 years had passed. He was, by every practical measure, safe. He had gotten away with it. And then he picked up a phone. There are a few frameworks people usually apply to this. The obvious one is ego. The idea that some offenders can't resist the compulsion to assert themselves into the story, to make themselves known, to prove that they exist and that they did this. There is psychological literature on this going back decades. It's a recognized pattern. But I want to offer a different lens, because the content of his communications is unusual even within that framework. He wasn't taunting investigators. He wasn't sending coded clues. He wasn't playing a game of intellectual cat and mouse in the style of cases we might be more familiar with. Instead, he was explaining himself, justifying, describing what he'd built. He wanted Child Find, an organization dedicated to returning missing children to their families, to understand that Nyleen was cared for, that she was educated, that she was loved in his framing of the word. He was, in a deeply warped way, seeking validation. This is a man who had constructed a private reality, a world in which what he had done made sense, in which a stolen child was not a victim but a beneficiary, in which he was not a criminal but a provider. And that world apparently required, at some level, external acknowledgement. It required someone outside of it to receive the message and understand. That tells us something about the psychology at work here. It also raises the possibility, uncomfortable but worth sitting with, that the communications were, on some level, a form of contact with Nyleen's family. A way of saying, she's here, I have her, she's mine now. The aftermath of Nyleen's disappearance is its own tragedy, run in parallel to the central mystery. Nyleen's mother, Nancy, never stopped searching. By 1994, the Marshall family had relocated to Japan, a detail that feels almost surreal against the backdrop of a rural Montana forest in 1983. The family was still moving, still trying to remake themselves around the absence at their center. In 1995, Nancy Marshall was raped and murdered in Mexico. She died without knowing what had happened to her daughter. There is something almost unbearable about that fact. Two disappearances, one sudden and physical, one slow and existential, converging in the life of one woman. In 1997, a nurse at a New Orleans hospital reported something that has never been explained or resolved. A young woman came in, approximately 19 years old, hoping to be admitted for childbirth. She introduced herself as Helena. She mentioned in passing that she thought her mother might have been named Nyleen. She said she'd grown up in another country, but she had no trace of a foreign accent. When hospital staff began asking more questions, the young woman and the man she was with left quickly. She was never identified. The timing is exact. A girl born in 1978, 4 years old in 1983, would be 19 in 1997, coming in to give birth. Is there a connection? No one knows. Law enforcement followed up, but the trail ended the moment that young woman walked out of that hospital. Most discussions of this case focus on who the man in the purple jogging suit was. And that's the right instinct. He's the most visible threat, the last person seen with Nyleen before she vanished. But I want to ask a different question. I want to ask about the game. Follow the shadow. That phrase has been mentioned in coverage of this case many times, usually as a detail that establishes the man's predatory intent, which it absolutely does. But the phrase itself is worth examining. It's not an obvious lure. It's not candy, or puppies, or any of the things we typically associate with stranger danger warnings aimed at children. It's more abstract, more poetic even. It requires the child to understand what a shadow is, to find the concept interesting enough to follow. For a 4-year-old in that late afternoon sun, with the light coming at an angle through the pine trees, shadows would be long and strange and shifting. They would look like something worth chasing. This man knew how to speak to a 4-year-old. He understood the threshold of their imagination. He had thought about this, possibly practiced it, possibly used it before. That is not an improvised abduction. That is methodology. Which leads to an uncomfortable question. If this was methodical, was Nyleen chosen specifically? Or was she simply the child who was in the right place at the right time and the right demographic to fit a predetermined plan? The Elkhorn Mountains picnic was a semi-public event for a radio club. The location would have been known in advance by club members and, potentially, by people who had access to that social circle. Someone could have known a family picnic was happening in that specific spot on that specific afternoon. That's a speculative thread, but it's one that, in 40 plus years, has never been satisfactorily pulled. There is one more element to this case that has generated significant discussion online, and I want to address it directly. Composite sketches were produced of two individuals seen in the area during the search of Nyleen, a man and a woman. Several people have noted that these composites bear a striking resemblance to Franklin Delano Floyd and Sharon Marshall, a case that is, if possible, even darker than what we've discussed today. Floyd was a convicted serial offender who abducted a young girl, later identified as Suzanne Sevicus, and raised her as his daughter before eventually marrying her. Sharon Marshall, as she was known, had Marshall as her assumed surname. The overlap, the surname, the composite resemblance, the profile of a man traveling with a young girl, has led some researchers to speculate about a possible connection. Law enforcement has never confirmed any link, and the composite resemblance is, at best, suggestive rather than definitive. But the pattern it points to, a man traveling the country with a taken child, presenting as a family unit, immune to scrutiny because the child has been so thoroughly removed from her original life that she doesn't know what she's missing. That pattern is real. It's documented. It's how these situations persist for years, even decades. If that pattern applies to Nyleen, then the letters and calls were from someone who had successfully constructed exactly that kind of parallel life, and who, for reasons that remain his own, felt the need to announce it. Nyleen Kay Marshall would be 47 years old today. Age-progressed images have been produced by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Her case remains officially open, classified as a non-family abduction. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Montana still takes tips. The anonymous caller and letter writer has never been identified. The man in the purple jogging suit has never been identified. The young woman in the New Orleans hospital in 1997 has never been identified. In a 2017 interview, the Jefferson County Sheriff said there were no substantial leads. The case is, in the truest sense, unsolved. But here's where I want to leave you. Because this channel isn't just about rehearsing the facts of dark events, it's about sitting with what those facts mean, about what they reveal when you hold them up to the light. What this case reveals, to me, is something about the nature of disappearance itself. We tend to think of it as an event, a moment when someone is there and then not there, a door opening and closing. But Nyleen's case is about the long, strange aftermath of disappearance. The letters, the calls, the sighting, the mother's murder, the trail of breadcrumbs leading nowhere. Disappearance, in cases like this, isn't an ending, it's a transformation. A child who existed inside one story, a Montana family, a forest picnic, a shallow creek with beaver dams, was taken and placed inside another story entirely. One told by someone else, one in which she had a different name, a different history, a different future. And somewhere, maybe she grew up inside that story. Maybe she never knew there was another one. The man who called said he loved her. He said she was happy. He said she liked to travel. We don't know if any of this was true. We don't know if any of that was intended to be believed. or if it was simply what he needed to say. But we do know that a 4-year-old girl played a game called Follow the Shadow on a June afternoon in Montana, and the shadow led somewhere no one has ever been able to follow. If you know anything, if any piece of this has landed somewhere familiar, somewhere uncomfortable, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office number is 406 225 4075, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children still has Nyleen's case open. She deserves to be found. Thanks for watching Obscure Ends. If this one stayed with you, leave it in the comments and subscribe if you want to keep going down the dark road. There's always more at the end of it.